Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. Autumn, 1883. The cottage in Northleach was not large by any standard that valued largeness, but it had 2 windows at the front, one in the sitting room and one above the door. A small unglazed oculus of the kind that village builders had included in Cotswold cottages for 300 years, without quite deciding what function they intended it to perform. And through the sitting room window, which Edward Holt discovered on the first morning and confirmed on the second, one could see, at the far end of the market square, the tower of St. Peter and St. Paul rising above the surrounding rooftops with the particular authority of a building that has been on that spot since the 14th century and intends to continue. It was the second morning, the 17th of September, 1883, that Edward became properly acquainted with the tower, because on the first morning he had been occupied with the unpacking of boxes in the manner that all first mornings in new lodgings are occupied, which is to say, the manner of a man who knows approximately where things should go, but has not yet confirmed this against the reality of the space available, with the result that books end up on the kitchen windowsill, and the kitchen implements end up on the shelf that would have done very well for the books, and the whole arrangement requires a second morning to correct. By the second morning, the books were on their proper shelves, and the kitchen implements were in their proper drawers, and Edward was able to sit at the window with his cup of tea and look at the tower without the competing anxiety of things not yet in their right places. He had come to Northleach for the reasons that retired men of modest means generally came to Cotswold villages in the 1880s, because it was beautiful, because the rent of a small cottage was within what his pension provided, and because after 35 years of teaching the history of England to boys in an Oxfordshire school, he had arrived at the advanced age of 64 with the particular feeling of a man who has spent his professional life describing things he has never fully seen for himself, and who wishes, before the remaining years make seeing difficult, to see them. The thing he wished to see was the Cotswolds as it had been, not the Cotswolds of the railway timetable and the tourist guide, not the Cotswolds of the ruined abbeys and the famous views, but the Cotswolds of the specific and the ordinary, the wool trade that had built these churches, the merchants whose money had funded these towers, the people whose names were still, in certain quiet corners of certain quiet churches, preserved in the kind of permanence that only metal achieves, engraved, flat, hard, cold, and entirely resistant to the passage of time in a way that wood and cloth and skin were not. He drank his tea. He looked at the tower. The morning was clear, and the autumn sun was doing what autumn sun does to Cotswold limestone, which is to turn it the colour of warm honey, the colour of something that has absorbed 300 years of English light and is quietly returning a portion of it. The tower caught this light on its upper courses and held it, and Edward, watching, thought that there was no building material in England that worked better with autumn than this stone, and that he had been a fool not to move here 20 years ago, and that it was not too late. He went to the church on the Thursday, which was the third day after his arrival, and he went in the manner of a man making a social call on someone he has been aware of for some time but has not previously met in person, with a combination of curiosity and a certain careful formality that the occasion seemed to require. He pushed open the south porch door and stepped inside and stood still for a moment while his eyes adjusted. St. Peter and St. Paul at Northleach was one of the finest of the Cotswold wool churches, which was saying a very great deal, because the finest of the Cotswold wool churches were among the finest parish churches in England, which was itself saying a very great deal, because the finest parish churches in England were buildings that would be considered outstanding anywhere in Europe. It had been built, or rather rebuilt, enlarged, and magnificently decorated in the 14th and 15th centuries with the proceeds of the Cotswold wool trade, specifically with the proceeds of the wool trade as channeled through the pious generosity of the wool merchants who had grown wealthy from it, and who had, in the manner of wealthy merchants across the centuries, elected to ensure their place in the next world by making substantial investments in the institutions that managed the relationship between this world and the next. The result of this generosity was a church of exceptional spaciousness and exceptional height, with perpendicular arches that rose to a clerestory, and a clerestory that admitted light through clear glass windows of the kind that the Victorian passion for coloured glass had mercifully not yet reached. The stone was the Cotswold limestone, honey gold, warm, slightly rough to the touch, the stone of the hills on which the sheep had grazed and whose wool had paid for every arch and every carving and every length of the roof beam above. Edward walked slowly down the nave. He was, at this stage, simply looking at the arches, at the font, at the fragments of medieval floor tile that the Victorian restorers had not entirely replaced, at the wooden choir stalls with their carved misericords. He was reading the church in the way he had always read history, as a text in which the details accumulated into argument, in which the specific evidence added up to a general truth that could not be stated without the specific evidence, and that was not fully available from the general truth alone. He was halfway down the nave when his boot found the edge of something. He looked down. Set in the stone floor, flush with its surface, was a brass memorial plaque. Not a small one. This was a substantial plate, approximately 18 inches wide and considerably longer, depicting in engraved lines a human figure in the dress of a medieval wool merchant, the long gown, the merchant's hat, the distinctive posture of a man of substance in the 15th century, and below, the figure, in Gothic lettering, the name and the date and the profession: John Forte, wool merchant, 1458. Edward stood over it for a long moment. Then he crouched down and looked at it more closely. The engraving was clear and detailed. The folds of the gown, the merchant's purse at his belt, the small figure of a sheep at his feet, the wool merchant's emblem, the source of the fortune that had built this building around this very plate. The face was generalized in the medieval manner, not a portrait but a type, the standard representation of a man of standing. But the hands were specific, and the gown's drape had the quality of something observed rather than invented, and the small sheep was drawn with the particular care of someone who knew what a sheep actually looked like and wished to be accurate about it. Edward put his hand flat on the plate. It was cold. It was metal. It was exactly as old as it said it was. 525 years since this man had lived and worked and died in this valley. 525 years, during which these hills had been green and these stones had been warm in autumn, and this church had been exactly here. He stood up. He looked at the plate for another long moment. He thought, I want to take this with me. I want to carry it out into the light. He returned to the cottage and found Haines's manual on the second shelf from the top, where he had placed it 3 days ago without quite knowing why he had placed it there, rather than with the general history shelf. The shelf where the county histories and the antiquarian surveys and the archaeological reports lived, and where it had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment to declare its relevance. Herbert Haines, A Manual of Monumental Brasses, published in 1861 by the Oxford University Press. 2 volumes with illustrations. Edward had owned it for a decade, had read it once when it arrived, had placed it on shelves in 3 successive houses without consulting it again. He took it down now and carried it to the sitting-room window and read it in the afternoon light with the attention of someone reading a thing for the first time despite having read it before. The manual was comprehensive and somewhat dry in the manner of Victorian antiquarian scholarship, which valued comprehensiveness above all other qualities and sacrificed brevity and elegance willingly in its service. But it was also, Edward discovered on this second reading, full of specific information that he had not retained from the first, information of a precisely practical kind. How to make a rubbing, what materials were required, what procedure produced the best results, what common errors were to be avoided. The rubbing of monumental brasses, the technique of laying paper over the engraved surface and transferring the image to the paper through the application of a waxy medium, had been practiced by antiquarians since the early decades of the century, Haines explained, and was now sufficiently established as a method to have produced several significant collections, including the collection of the Oxford Architectural and Historical Society, whose members had been systematically recording the brasses of Oxfordshire churches since the 1840s. The materials required were simple: a roll of white paper, wide enough to cover the brass in question, a supply of heel ball, which was the waxy compound used for polishing the heels of boots, and which, by a fortunate coincidence of its composition, beeswax, tallow, and lampblack, all in proportions that gave it the right hardness and the right blackness, transferred to paper with exactly the quality of line that the engraved brass produced, and masking tape for securing the paper to the stone floor on all sides before beginning work. The procedure, as Haines described it, was this: lay the paper over the brass, secure all edges firmly, allow 20 minutes for the paper to adjust to the temperature and humidity of the stone floor. Press the fingers along the edges of the brass to feel where the engraving lay beneath the paper. Then rub with the heel ball in long, even strokes, beginning at the top of the figure and working downward, holding the heel ball nearly flat against the paper rather than at the angle one might use for rubbing a coin, keeping the other hand spread flat on the paper as a guide and as a means of keeping the paper still. The result, if the technique was correctly applied, was a full-scale reproduction of the brass, the figure in its medieval dress, the inscription in its Gothic lettering, the heraldic devices and the emblems and the decorative borders, all transferred to paper in black on white, clear and permanent. A record that could be rolled up and carried home and examined at leisure and stored safely and, if necessary, sent to anyone who might benefit from knowing that this particular brass existed and looked like this. Edward put the manual down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. He thought, "In the morning, I will go to Northleach Market Square and buy what I need." The following morning, before the shops in the market square had fully opened, Edward sat at his desk with the manual open beside him and made a list. The list was the kind of list that a former schoolmaster makes when undertaking a new project, complete, ordered, with subcategories, and with a column at the right side for notes and questions. The items on the main list were white paper, roll from the stationer, heel ball from the bootmaker, masking tape, a soft brush for cleaning the brass surface before laying the paper, a flat cushion for kneeling on, this being a practical concession to his 64 years that he would not have included at 40, a canvas bag large enough to carry the roll of paper without bending it, which the paper must not be bent, the notebook in which he was already writing, which was the notebook that accompanied him everywhere and in which he had, over the years, recorded the things that needed recording, the observations that resisted the pressures of time and fatigue, and the general tendency of unwritten things to not exist. In the notes column, he wrote, "Haines says paper must be wide enough to cover the full brass in one piece. The forte brass at Northleach is approximately 18 inches wide and perhaps 4 feet long. Standard stationer's roll paper is 22 inches wide, which should suffice for the width. The length can be managed by unrolling as one progresses." He wrote, "Haines says the heel ball must be held nearly flat. The wider the surface of contact, the better, for an even coat. He says the common error is to use the edge of the heel ball as one would use a pencil, which produces uneven dark lines where the raised parts of the brass are greatest rather than an even transference of the entire surface." He wrote in a separate section of the notebook that was not the list but was adjacent to it, in the way that thinking aloud sections were always adjacent to his working lists. John Forte died in 1458. He was a wool merchant, which in the Northleach of the 15th century meant that he was among the most important people in one of the most important wool trading towns in the most important wool-producing region in England. The church in which his brass lies was built substantially by the money of men like him. The sheep at his feet is not decoration. It is biography. He is telling you, from the brass, what he was, which is to say, he is still telling you. In 1883, still, he put down the pen. He closed the notebook. He picked up his coat and his canvas bag, which already contained the manual and the notebook, and he went out into the market square to buy what was needed. Northleach was a town of modest scale that had been, in its medieval prime, a place of considerable significance, one of the great wool trading centres of the Cotswolds, a place where the wool staplers and the merchants from the Low Countries had conducted the business that had made the region wealthy and the church magnificent, and that had since settled with the equanimity of a place that knows its own history and is not anxious about its present, into the comfortable dimensions of a market town of the sort that existed all across rural England in the 1880s, with its market square, its inns, its church, its collection of tradespeople, providing the practical necessities of a village life, and its particular atmosphere of a place that has seen grander days and does not regret them. The stationer occupied a shop on the north side of the square. It was the kind of shop that had everything necessary and nothing superfluous, its goods arranged on shelves in the logical order of a person who understood that their customers knew what they needed and did not require encouragement toward what they did not. Edward explained what he wanted: white paper in a roll, as wide as the widest available. The stationer produced a roll of 22-inch paper, the kind used by butchers and by drafters of plans, and Edward examined it and found it suitable. He bought 2 rolls. The bootmaker was in a lane off the square. He was an older man with the particular hands of someone who has spent 40 years working leather, and he produced from beneath his counter a tin of heel ball with the air of a man producing something whose use he was entirely certain of. "Shoe heel, is it?" he said. "Yes and no," Edward said. The bootmaker looked at him with the look of a man who has heard everything and is not surprised by the partial answer. He sold Edward the tin without further inquiry. The masking tape required an errand to the ironmonger, who had it in the back of a drawer and who quoted a price that Edward considered reasonable and paid without negotiation. He also bought, at the market stall on the square, a flat cushion of the kind used in kneeling at prayer, which the stall holder sold without any inquiry into its intended use, this being a product whose standard use was sufficiently clear to make alternative uses seem unlikely. Edward took it without explanation. He was home by 10:30, all items assembled on the kitchen table. He set them out in the order in which they would be used: the brush first, for cleaning the brass, then the paper and the masking tape, then the heel ball, then the cushion. He laid his hand on the heel ball tin and opened it. The material inside was dark, waxy, dense. The smell of it was the smell of shoe polish and beeswax, and something else beneath both of those, something older and more fundamental that he thought might simply be the smell of wax itself, of a material that humans had been using to record and preserve since long before shoes required polishing. He put the lid back on. He put on his coat. He picked up the canvas bag. He found the vicar, a thin, elderly man named Payne, who wore a permanently worried expression of the kind that long incumbencies of large churches sometimes produce. In the vestry, going through papers with the resigned attention of someone who has been going through the same papers for 30 years and has long since ceased to expect them to resolve themselves into order. Edward explained who he was, where he had come from, what he proposed to do. Payne listened with the wariness of a man who has had many proposals made to him in this vestry over the years, and has learned to assess them before committing to enthusiasm. Rubbing the brasses, Payne said, when Edward had finished. Yes, with paper and wax. Heelball, a compound of beeswax and tallow and lampblack. It makes a black mark on the paper where the raised surface of the brass is, leaving the incised lines white. The result is a precise reproduction of the plate. Payne appeared to consider this. He had the expression of a man who is deciding whether an activity is sufficiently decorous for his church and sufficiently harmless to his flaws. After a moment, he appeared to conclude that it was, though he maintained the worry in his expression as a kind of reserve fund of concern to be drawn on if required. The forte brass, he said. Yes, and anything else you have that I haven't noticed yet. This produced the first modification of the worry into something that might, at a considerable stretch, be called approval. There are several others, Payne said. I don't think anyone has paid them very much attention. He paused. You may use the church. Please leave the floor as you find it. Edward thanked him, took the key to the south porch, and went through into the nave. He laid the paper over the forte brass. He secured it with the masking tape on all four sides, pulling it tight against the stone. He left it for 20 minutes, as Haines had specified, though he found the 20 minutes difficult to simply wait through. This being the impatience of someone who is committed to a new project and wishes to see its first product immediately. He spent the 20 minutes walking slowly around the church, reading the other memorials, noting the ones that merited attention. When he returned to the brass, he pressed his fingers along the paper's surface, feeling for the edges of the engraving, feeling the shape of John Forte's outline through the paper, the raised lines that marked the gown's hem and the merchant's hat and the sheep's woolly back. He had not expected this to be affecting. It was affecting. He picked up the heel ball. The first strokes were too hard. He could see, even as he was doing it, that the pressure was wrong, that the heel ball was cutting rather than transferring, that the result would be uneven. He stopped. He adjusted his grip. He began again, flatter, slower, more even. The image that emerged was blurred, not completely blurred. One could see that a figure was present, and the hat was recognizable, and the general shape of a medieval merchant in his gown was distinguishable from the background, but blurred in the way of something seen through glass that has not been cleaned, present but not clear. The inscription at the bottom was illegible. Edward sat back on his heels and looked at it. He thought, this is the first attempt. The first attempt is never the right thing. He rolled the failed paper up and put it in his bag. He returned the following morning with the same materials and the additional knowledge that the previous attempt had given him, which was the knowledge of what not to do, which is always the most expensive knowledge to acquire, but also the most reliable, being knowledge derived from direct experience of failure rather than from second-hand instruction. He laid the paper more carefully this time, pulling the masking tape tighter at each corner before securing the sides. He waited the full 20 minutes without impatience. Indeed, he spent the 20 minutes reading the inscription on a smaller plate he had noticed the day before, a plate that commemorated a man named Thomas Wilkins who had died in 1492 and who had evidently been a man of sufficient piety to merit mention of 3 chantry masses a week in perpetuity, a perpetuity that had lasted exactly 62 years before the Reformation had dissolved the chantry and made the inscription retrospectively optimistic. When he returned to the forte brass, he pressed his fingers along the paper more slowly than the previous day, not to locate the edges of the figure, he knew those already, but to feel the quality of the surface, the places where the engraving was deepest and therefore the raised lines highest, the places where it was shallower and the transfer would be more delicate. He formed a picture in his fingers before he began with the heel ball. He held the heel ball almost horizontal, the flat of it against the paper rather than the edge, and began at the top of the figure's head. Long, even strokes, left to right, the pressure consistent, the hand moving down by an inch with each stroke, the way one paints a wall rather than the way one draws a picture. The paper darkened steadily. The figure emerged. It emerged slowly, which was itself interesting, the gradual appearance of a thing that had been there all along but invisible, the way a photographic image develops in its chemical bath, the way frost reveals the underlying pattern of a window pane. John Forte came into the paper by degrees. First the general shape of him, then the hat, then the gown's upper drape, then the purse at his belt, then the hands, then the lower hem, and then, at the bottom of the plate, appearing last and arriving with the quality of a statement made at the end of a long explanation, the sheep, the wool merchant's sheep, small and competent, occupying the corner of the plate with the quiet authority of a thing that knows why it is there. Edward stopped. He set down the heel ball. He looked at what he had made. It was not perfect. The inscription was slightly uneven where his pressure had varied, and there was a ghost of a smear at the upper right corner where the paper had shifted slightly despite the masking tape. But the figure was clear, and the sheep was clear, and John Forte was on the paper in the way that John Forte had been on the brass for 425 years, and the paper was now a thing that Edward could carry with him out of the church and into the light of the morning. He did not move immediately. He looked at the rubbing for several minutes, letting the fact of it settle, that he had done this, that it worked, that John Forte was on his paper. He carried the rubbing home rolled in his canvas bag, which was the moment at which its fragility became apparent. The rolled paper was both durable and delicate. Durable in the sense that the heel ball image was fixed and would not smear. Delicate in the sense that the paper would crease if folded, and the image would be damaged if rolled too tightly. He walked back through the market square with the bag held slightly away from his side, which was not a posture he would ordinarily have adopted, and which attracted from a woman at the baker's a look of mild enquiry that he returned with the bland expression of someone who is doing something entirely ordinary and does not require explanation. In the cottage, he unrolled the rubbing on the kitchen table and stood back to look at it properly in the better light. The image was clear and convincing. John Forte, wool merchant of Northleach, 1458, as he had been recorded on the floor of his church by whoever had made the brass, now also recorded on Edward's paper by Edward's heel ball on the 17th of September, 1883. The scale was exact. This was a full-size copy, not a reduced reproduction, not an engraving or a sketch, but a direct transference of the plate surface to the paper at 1:1. If one placed this paper back over the brass, The two images would coincide exactly, every line falling on every corresponding line. He went to the sitting room. He found the small box of hanging hooks and the hammer that he had put in the kitchen drawer on the first morning and transferred to the correct drawer on the second. He went back to the kitchen table and looked at the rubbing again. He decided where he would hang it, on the sitting room wall, between the window and the bookshelf, at a height at which one could look at it from the armchair without craning. He hung it. He sat in the armchair. He looked at John Forte on his wall. There was something that he could only call companionship in the arrangement, not friendship, because friendship required a reciprocity that a brass rubbing could not provide, but something in the same family, the quality of another presence in a room that had previously held only one. John Forte was not a person. He was an image of a person who had died 425 years ago. But the image had been made by a person, the medieval craftsman who had engraved the brass, and transmitted to Edward's wall by Edward's own hands. And in this chain of makers and transmitters, there was a kind of human continuity that Edward found, sitting in his armchair in the September afternoon, unexpectedly moving. He thought, I want more of these. He was introduced to Thomas Arkell the following Sunday in the church porch, in the manner in which village introductions are generally made, by circumstance rather than intention, by the proximity of two people whose paths intersected at a point of mutual interest without either having arranged for the intersection to occur. Edward had come to the morning service and was examining, after the congregation had departed, a fragmentary inscription on the porch wall that he had noticed during the service and wished to read properly. Tom was sitting on the porch step, cleaning mud off his boots with a stick, which was the action of a boy who had been firmly instructed about the state of his boots before entering the church and was performing the required cleaning with the efficiency of someone who has been given a specific task and intends to complete it in the minimum time consistent with the appearance of compliance. Tom was 12 years old, dark-haired, with the broad, open face of a Gloucestershire boy, and the direct gaze of someone who had not yet learned that direct gazing was considered impolite in adults. He looked at Edward with the frank assessment of a child evaluating an unknown grown-up, and apparently finding the evaluation satisfactory, he said, "Are you the man who lies on the church floor?" This was a more direct opening than Edward had expected. "I don't lie on it," he said. "I kneel on it. There is a difference. Jimmy Thatch said you lie on it and rub things." "Jimmy Thatch is partially correct," Edward said. "I kneel on a cushion and I make rubbings of the brass memorial plates. It is a method of copying them so that they can be examined and recorded." He paused, assessing whether this explanation was sufficient or whether more was required. The directness of Tom's gaze suggested that more was required. "The plates are very old," he said. "Some of them are 500 years old. If they are not copied, and if something happens to the church, a fire or restoration work, or simply the slow damage that time does to metal, the record they contain will be lost. The copies ensure that the record survives, even if the plates do not." Tom considered this. His stick continued its work on the boot heel. "Who were the people on them?" he asked. "Wool merchants mostly. This was a wool trading town in the Middle Ages. The merchants who made money from the trade paid for the church to be built, and when they died, they were commemorated with brass plates in the church floor. Do you know their names? Some of them. The plates tell you when the plates can still be read. Tom looked at his boot, apparently satisfied, and stood. He was a boy who processed information by thinking about it visibly, in a pause before responding, which was a quality that Edward recognized and approved of, having spent 35 years attempting to cultivate it in boys who generally preferred to respond immediately and wrongly. "I know which door the verger keeps unlocked on weekdays," he said, "in case you need to get in when Reverend Payne isn't about." "That is," said Edward, "very useful information." October announced itself at the Lizard by a shift in the quality of the light and a change in the sound of the Cotswolds, which was to say, October announced itself at Northleach in the way that October in the Cotswolds always announces itself, which is not dramatically but definitely through the specific changes that the month makes to a landscape already calibrated for exactly this kind of change. The honey goldstone became, imperceptibly but certainly, more golden, as if the diminishing sun gave the limestone a colour it could not quite produce in the full light of summer. The beeches on the road to Bourton turned. The sheep moved down from the higher ground. The early mornings had a cold in them that was the cold of a season that has made its decision and will not be argued with. Edward had been in Northleach for 3 weeks. He had made 4 rubbings in those 3 weeks. The forte brass, which was now on his sitting-room wall, a smaller plate commemorating a Thomas Wilkins of 1492, which was leaned against the bookshelf, waiting for a nail. A fragment of an inscription from a church 2 miles north of the town, from which most of the figure had been lost, but the name and date remained. Agnes Holcott, 1421, and a 4th, also from the Northleach Church, which he had found only by looking very carefully at a section of floor near the north wall that had been partially covered by a later pew installation, and which showed, when the pew was carefully moved aside with Payne's permission and Tom's assistance, a small plate of the kind used to commemorate children. No figure, just a name and a date and a brief inscription. The name was William. The date was 1447. The inscription said only, "Beloved." He had sat for a long time beside this one after he had finished the rubbing. He did not know what to do with the feeling it produced, which was not exactly grief, because he had not known this child, but was something adjacent to grief, something in the same neighborhood. The recognition of a loss so old that it was beyond the reach of consolation, that required nothing from him except acknowledgement. He rolled the rubbing carefully and placed it with the others. On its label, in his careful hand, he wrote, "William, beloved child, St. Peter and St. Paul, Northleach, 1447. Then he added, below, copied, September, 1883. E. Holt. He had not planned to include his own name. He did not know why he had. He looked at the label and decided it was right and did not change it. The churches of the Cotswolds were, in the 1880s, accessible to anyone with the patience to find their vicars and the diplomacy to explain their purposes. Some were open, some were locked with their keys held by the vicar, the verger, or a designated householder in the village. Some were locked with their keys held by persons who had died and whose whereabouts of keys were therefore uncertain, and some were, as Edward discovered, at a small church 3 miles south of Northleach, locked with a key that no one in the village could precisely identify, but that Tom Arkle, who had taken to accompanying Edward on the shorter excursions with a combination of useful knowledge and the general inquisitiveness of a 12-year-old of above-average intelligence, believed was kept under a stone in the churchyard near the east wall, because he had seen the gardener put it there once when he was 8. The key was indeed under the stone. The church was indeed unlockable. Inside, in the half-light of a morning that was overcast and therefore providing the particular flat, grey light of clouds that Edward was learning to regard as the best light for brass rubbing, because it eliminated the shadows that raking sunlight cast across the plates and made the raised lines harder to distinguish from the flat surface. He found, in addition to the font and the piscina and the Norman doorway that the church guide mentioned, 2 brasses that the church guide did not mention, because the church guide had been written 30 years ago by a vicar who had been primarily interested in the architecture and had not paid attention to the floor. The first was small, an inscription only, no figure, commemorating a woman named Joan Compton, who had died in 1398 and who was described as the wife of Richard Compton, without further information about Richard Compton or why he had merited a wife who received a brass inscription, while he apparently had not. Edward copied the inscription and noted in his book, Joan Compton, 1398. Inscription only. Condition, good, no figure. Note, husband not commemorated in same church. Why? The second brass was damaged. Not destroyed, damaged. The upper section, which would have shown the figure's head and upper body, was present, but its surface had been scratched and scored, possibly at some point during the Civil War, when parliamentary soldiers had visited many Cotswold churches and expressed their opinions on Catholic imagery through the medium of deliberate disfigurement. The lower section was intact, the lower folds of a gown, a pair of feet in pointed shoes of the 15th century, and a small animal at the feet that was either a dog or a sheep, ambiguously rendered. Edward copied what was there, scoring across the damaged area carefully, producing a rubbing that showed the damage honestly, the scored lines appearing as white scratches across the heel ball black, the history of the damage visible in the copy as clearly as the history of the original was visible in the brass. He labelled this rubbing, unknown figure, Ampney St. Mary, circa 1440, estimated from footwear. Upper section damaged, probably Civil War. He thought about this as he walked back through the October fields with Tom beside him, carrying the bag. The damage was part of the history. The rubbing that included the damage was more honest than a rubbing that somehow pretended the damage was not there. He spent the evening with his notes for the Ampney brass, working through what the damage told him and what it did not. The physical evidence was this. The scratching on the upper section was not random. It had the quality of deliberate defacement, of marks made to obscure rather than to decorate, of someone who had taken something sharp to the brass with the intention of removing what was depicted. The medieval figure in church brasses was almost always religious in its symbolism. The hands were often folded in prayer, the figure surrounded by angels or canopies of saints, the inscription invoking the mercy of God in the terms that the medieval church used, and the Reformation had subsequently found objectionable. The person who had scratched this brass had been objecting to something. The year 1642 appeared in the churchwarden's accounts, which Payne had allowed Edward to examine in the vestry on the first day. The year 1642 was the year of the Civil War's beginning, and the Cotswolds had been contested ground, and parliamentary soldiers had passed through Ampney St. Mary in that year, and certain items of ecclesiastical furniture and decoration had been removed or damaged. This was the context. The scratching was the evidence. He wrote in his notebook, "The rubbing of the Ampney brass includes necessarily the evidence of what was done to it in 1642. This is correct. A rubbing that reproduced only the original design and omitted the damage would be a less accurate record than a rubbing that included both, because the brass as it now exists includes the damage, and the damage is part of its history. A history that cannot be damaged is not a history, it is a story." He looked at this sentence for a moment, and then closed the notebook without crossing it out, which was the action he took with sentences that he felt were trying to say something real, but had not yet said it quite correctly, and which required time to develop into the correct form rather than immediate revision into a more comfortable version. The rubbing of the Ampney brass was unrolled and propped against the sitting room wall, beside the forte brass and the Thomas Wilkins inscription, and the small rubbing of William the Beloved Child. They made a group, these four, different in size and quality and period, representing different kinds of people from different moments of the same valley's history, but all present in the same room, all on Edward's white paper, all having passed through his hands. He thought, what else is in these churches that no one has copied? How many more are there? He opened Haines's manual to the chapter on Gloucestershire. By the end of October, Edward had made 9 rubbings from 5 churches, and the technique had settled into the form that techniques take when they have been practiced enough times to stop requiring conscious attention. The form of something one does, rather than something one thinks about doing. He no longer consulted the manual for the procedure. He knew when the paper was correctly tensioned by the feel of it under his fingers. He knew how much pressure to apply to the heel ball for each type of surface, more for the shallower engravings of the later period, less for the deeply cut lines of the 14th century. He knew how long to spend on any given section to achieve an even tone without overworking it and producing the heavy clotted blacks that indicated too much wax. What he had not known and was learning was how to manage the physical demands of the work on a body of 64 years. The kneeling was the principal difficulty, not the act of kneeling itself, which the cushion managed reasonably well, but the duration of kneeling required for a large brass, 2 hours or more for the forte plate, and the particular demands that this made on the lower back, which had been informing him of its opinions on the subject with increasing specificity as October progressed. He had addressed this by developing a rotation: kneel, work a section, sit back on his heels, stand briefly and walk the width of the nave, return, kneel, work the next section. The larger brasses required 3 complete circuits of this rotation, which added time to the work, but preserved him for the following day. Tom, who accompanied him on perhaps half of his excursions, had developed, without being asked, the role of assistant. He held sections of paper flat when Edward needed both hands on the heel ball. He carried the bag on the longer walks. He knew the state of every church door in a 5-mile radius and several in a 10-mile radius. And he asked, at approximately 20-minute intervals, questions about the people being copied that Edward was generally able to answer and occasionally could not, the unanswerable questions being the most interesting ones. "Why is there a fish on this one?" Tom asked, standing over a small brass in a church near Bourton, whose figure was accompanied by an emblematic fish of uncertain iconographic significance. "I think," Edward said, "it indicates that the person was particularly devout. Fish are a Christian symbol from the early church." "Or they liked fish," Tom said. Edward looked at the brass. The fish was positioned at the figure's feet, in the same location where other brasses had the wool merchant's sheep or the knight's lion. "Or they liked fish," he agreed. He noted this in his book as a possibility he was unable to resolve. He found her in a church near Chedworth. Not the Chedworth Roman villa, which was the thing that visitors came to Chedworth to see, but the church which visitors to the Roman villa generally did not visit, this being a feature of the organization of interest in the ancient world that Edward had always found slightly perverse. The church had been locked when he arrived, but Tom had located the churchwarden by the simple method of asking at the public house, and the churchwarden had produced a large iron key that opened a door that Edward would not have identified as a door without being shown it, because it was the same color and texture as the surrounding stone wall and was distinguishable from it only by the handle. Inside the church, after the usual process of allowing his eyes to adjust to the light and then walking the entire interior before committing to any particular target, Edward found in the south transept a brass that stopped him. It was a woman's figure, approximately 14 inches wide and 3 feet long, of excellent execution and good condition, the engraving clear and the surface only lightly worn. She was in the dress of the late 14th century, a long gown with fitted sleeves, a headdress of the style worn in the 1380s and 90s, her hands folded at her waist holding a book. The book, Edward noted, was not a generic religious attribute, but was rendered with specific care. It was thick, with visible pages, a leather binding shown in detail. A woman who had been important enough to merit a good brass had been depicted holding a specific book, and the specific book had been depicted with care. There was no inscription. The slab in which the brass had been set had a space for an inscription at the top and another at the bottom, and both spaces were empty, whether because the inscription had been a separate piece that had been lost, or because the brass had always been made without a name. He could not determine. No name. Good condition. Late 14th century. A woman with a book. He copied her. The rubbing was among the best he had made so far. The engraving's quality translated well to paper. Every fold of the gown clear, the headdress precise, the book in her hands identifiable as a book and not merely a rectangular shape. He labelled the rubbing. Unknown woman, holding book, St. Mary's, near Chedworth, circa 1390, from dress. No inscription. Then he sat for a while in the pew and looked at the brass itself before he rolled the rubbing up. He thought about naming. He thought about all the people who had ever existed who were not named in any record that survived them, whose passage through the world had left traces only in objects and places, never in words. He thought about what the book meant to whoever had chosen to depict her holding it. He thought, she was real. She held a book. Someone cared enough to record this. I don't know her name, but I know these things. The letter from Clara arrived in the second week of October, forwarded from the Oxford address and bearing the evidence of having made this journey in the slight denting of its envelope and the extra postmark of the forwarding office. Clara was his daughter, 36 years old, married to a solicitor in North Oxford, the mother of 2 boys who were 8 and 5, and who occupied the foreground of her letters in the way that children of those ages occupy the foreground of a parent's letters, comprehensively. The letter was warm and specific and full of the details of the household, the older boy's school, the younger boy's current enthusiasm for a species of beetle that had colonized the garden, the solicitor's recent case that had turned on a point of property law that Clara described with the dry accuracy of a person who has heard a great deal of property law and has formed a complete opinion of it. At the end of the letter, in the way that the important things in Clara's letters were often positioned, at the end, after the full account of the foreground, as if the foreground needed to be cleared before the thing itself could be stated, she wrote, "Father, your last letter described these brass plates with a degree of enthusiasm that I have not heard in your letters since I was a girl, and you were talking about the Flemish altar panels at the Ashmolean. I conclude that you have found something useful to do in Northleach. I am very glad. The knees, however, cold stone floors in October, are not a recommendation for longevity. Please buy a thicker cushion." Edward read this twice. He folded the letter and put it in the drawer where he kept Clara's letters. He went to the kitchen and looked at the cushion he currently used, which was the flat prayer cushion from the market stall, which was not, if he were honest, thick enough for the duration of the longer sessions. He resolved to buy a thicker one, and then did not go immediately, because the afternoon was clear and the church in the next village was, according to the churchwarden, whom Tom had located, unlocked on Tuesdays. He wrote to Clara that evening, "My dear Clara, the knees manage. The stone manages less well in November than in September, which is a universal observation applicable to most things. I have found 13 brasses in 11 churches, of which 9 are uncatalogued in Haines, and 3 may be entirely unrecorded. I have not bought a thicker cushion, but I intend to. The smallest boys, how is the younger one's beetle? Does it have a name?" He sealed the letter. He put it on the hall table for the morning post. He looked for a moment at the growing collection of rubbings on the sitting-room wall, and the ones leaned against the bookshelves, and the rolled ones in the corner. He thought, 13 in 11 churches. He was not counting them for the count's sake, but the count was real, and the count was accumulating. November brought the specific problem of the short day. The Cotswolds in November had light from approximately 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, which was 9 hours, adequate in the abstract for a great deal of productive work, but in practice reduced by the time required for meals and travel, and by the quality of the light itself, which in November was never the clear working light of September and October, but was instead a light of variable reliability that alternated between the overcast flatness that was actually best for brass rubbing, being consistent and shadow-free, and the low-angled raking light of the brief bright days, which cast hard shadows across the brasses and made the engraved lines difficult to distinguish from the surrounding surface. Tom understood the light. This was not a fact that Edward had expected, and was one that he found genuinely valuable. Tom had grown up in the Cotswolds and had the native understanding of the sky that people who work or play outdoors from childhood develop as naturally as they develop speech. The understanding that was not meteorological knowledge, but something more immediate and physical. The ability to look at the sky at 7 in the morning and make a reliable prediction about its state at noon. He began meeting Edward at the cottage gate on mornings when he thought the light would be good, which was approximately twice a week through November, and he was right about the light more often than he was wrong. "Good light today," he said on a morning in the second week of November, appearing at the gate at 7:30 with the completeness of someone who has been ready for some time. "Cloud off the west, should hold till 2. Edward, who had been eating his breakfast and contemplating the morning, looked at the sky and found it to be what Tom described. Cloud off the west, flat and even. Good light for the interior work. "Winchcombe direction," he said. "Bourton is closer, and there's 3 churches in an hour of each other." Bourton, then. They went. They found in the first church a well-preserved knight's brass of the early 15th century that Edward had not known about. In the second, a palimpsest, which was a brass that had been turned over and re-engraved on the reverse, offering a figure on one side that was clearly earlier than the inscription on the other, and suggesting that someone in the 16th century had found it more economical to reuse an existing plate than to commission a new one. And in the third church, nothing whatsoever, the floor being entirely of Victorian tile that had replaced the medieval stone and any brasses that might have been in it. This third church required an hour of walking in and out of the light, which turned out to have held until 3 rather than 2, which Tom accepted as the limit of his forecasting accuracy. The knight's brass was in a church in a village whose name Edward noted carefully, because the brass was entirely absent from Haines's Gloucestershire survey, which meant that either Haines had not visited this church or had visited and overlooked it, and either possibility was of interest. The church was small, with a single nave and no clerestory, the kind of small Norman foundation that had been modified rather than rebuilt in the succeeding centuries, and its floor was partially original stone, the Victorian restorer having confined his attention to the chancel and left the nave's medieval surface intact. The brass occupied approximately 6 feet of that surface, which was the largest Edward had so far encountered, and it depicted, with the vigour and precision of the best Flemish-influenced brass-making of the early 15th century, a knight in full armour of the period between the great plate armour of the late 14th century and the more fully articulated forms of the mid-15th. The visor raised, the face visible in the generalised but dignified manner of the best brasses, the gauntlets at rest on the pommel of a sword, and at the knight's feet a lion, rendered with the same competence as the Forte Brass's sheep, the same quality of accurate observation given to an animal that the engraver had presumably seen. The knight had a name. It was engraved in a band around the edge of the brass, in the Lombardic script that was preferred for brasses of this period, and it read, "Here lies Richard de Frome, knight, who served faithfully and died in the year of our Lord, 1412. Pray for his soul. Richard de Frome, died 1412, 471 years ago." A knight in the service of Edward looked at the heraldic devices on the shield, which were not from any family he immediately recognized, but which he would look up in his reference books when he got home. A knight who had been commemorated with a brass of this quality and scale was a man of real standing, a man whose family had invested significantly in his memory, and the fact that this brass was unknown to Haines suggested that the family's memory of the investment had lasted less well than the investment itself. He copied the brass in 3 sessions across the morning, the night emerging section by section, the armor's detail transferring clearly to the paper, the lion at the feet, arriving last and arriving well. Tom held the sections flat while Edward worked. Neither of them spoke much, which was one of the things Edward appreciated about Tom, that he understood when silence was appropriate and did not require conversation to fill it. On the walk back from the church where Richard de Frome lay, Edward stopped at a dry stone wall at the top of a field and put his bag down and leaned against the wall and looked south across the Cotswolds as it stretched away toward the horizon. The November afternoon light was the light of a season that had settled its accounts and was preparing to depart without apology. Low, slightly golden, the shadows long, the dry stone walls casting their shadows across the pale grass in lines that made the fields look like a text written in a script no one had decoded. The church they had come from was visible from here, a tower above the trees, small in the distance. Tom was ahead on the path, making his way down the hill with the loose-limbed confidence of a boy on familiar ground. Edward looked at the church tower. He thought about Richard de Frome in his armour, lying on the floor of that church since 1412, unvisited by anyone who knew his brass was there, waiting with the patience of things that do not know they are waiting, waiting in the way that the dry stone walls waited, in the way that the church tower waited, in the way that the Cotswold hills waited, simply present, simply real, not requiring acknowledgement to continue being real. He had been a history teacher for 35 years. He had spent 35 years standing in front of boys and telling them about things that had happened, about people who had lived, about the movements of armies and the decisions of kings and the gradual transformations of societies over centuries. He had done this well, he thought, or at least adequately. The boys had generally passed their examinations, and some of them had gone on to read history at university, and a few had written to him in later years to say that something he had taught them had mattered. But the history he had taught had been, always, a history of generals and kings and parliaments and movements, a history whose smallest unit was the great event and whose largest unit was the civilization. What he was doing here, on his knees on cold church floors with his heel ball and his paper, was a history of the other kind, the history whose smallest unit was the individual human being, the person who had lived here, in this valley, in this century, who had died and been commemorated with whatever means their family could afford, and whose commemoration had survived when their family's memory of them had not. It was not the history of what had changed the world. It was the history of people who had not changed the world but had lived in it and had been loved enough to be remembered, and were now remembered only because the metal lasted and a retired schoolmaster from Oxford had come to Northleach with a roll of paper and a tin of heel ball. He pushed off the wall. He picked up his bag. "Tom," he called down the hill, "is there anything in Bourton direction we haven't looked at?" He unrolled the Richard de Frome rubbing that evening on the kitchen table and spread it to its full length, which required the table's full extension and the removal of everything that was normally on the table. 6 feet of paper. A knight in full early 15th century armour, black on white, every articulation of the plate armour reproduced in the black of the heel ball and the white of the paper's surface, the heraldic shield on his left arm, the sword under his right gauntlet, the lion at his feet with its particular look of composed authority that the medieval engravers gave to heraldic lions as a matter of convention, but that this engraver had somehow made convincing. Edward stood at one end of the table and looked down the length of it at Richard de Frome. The rubbing was the best thing he had made. This was not an opinion he arrived at immediately, but was the conclusion of approximately 20 minutes of looking at it from various distances and angles and comparing it in his memory to the previous rubbings, the forte brass, the ampney damage, the unnamed woman with the book, the small brasses of the inscription-only kind. The de Frome rubbing was better than all of those, clearer, more even, more completely representative of the original, which was partly because the brass itself was better made and better preserved than the others, and partly because Edward's technique had improved over 9 weeks, to the point at which he was producing results that the manual would have recognized as competent. He thought about where to hang it. The sitting room wall was running out of space. He had already moved 2 rubbings to the bedroom wall and 1 to the hallway. He thought, if I continue at this rate, I will require a larger house. He thought this with the particular quality of contentment that arrives when a problem is a pleasant one, when the difficulty is an excess of the thing one wanted rather than a deficiency of it. He rolled the de Frome rubbing carefully and put it with the others in the wooden box that he had constructed from the pine crate his books had arrived in, which served adequately as a storage container for the rolled papers, and which had the additional advantage of being clearly labelled in Tom's handwriting on the lid. Tom having offered this service on the grounds that his handwriting was better than Edward's for large print, which was not entirely accurate, but was accurate enough. The Cotswolds collection, with a date, range below it, 1883. The dash was Tom's own addition. Edward had not asked for a dash. Tom had put one there, and Edward had looked at it and left it, because the dash was correct. It was not finished. At the end of November, on a Saturday morning, when the rain made excursion impractical, and Tom had gone to Cheltenham with his family, Edward opened his working notebook to the page he had been using as a running catalogue and counted 23 brasses from 14 churches across a radius of approximately 8 miles from Northleach. Of these 23, 11 were listed in Haines's manual for Gloucestershire. 3 were listed in Haines's manual for Oxfordshire, with notes indicating they had not been personally inspected by Haines, and 9 were entirely unlisted, either not known to Haines or overlooked in his survey, which was not a survey specifically of Gloucestershire, but of the county as one component of a larger national survey that had the usual limitations of any survey conducted by one person over a limited period of time. He had notes on each: condition, date estimate, where the date was not inscribed, the status of the inscription, legible, partially legible, illegible, absent, the quality of the engraving, excellent, good, fair, poor, the subject matter, wool merchant, knight, priest, woman, child, unidentifiable, and his own assessment of the rubbing's quality, A being the diaphragm and the forte, B being the majority, C being the amply damaged brass, which was C not because the rubbing was poor, but because the brass itself was too damaged to produce a better result. He wrote at the bottom of the page, 23 brasses. This is not a large collection. The Oxford Architectural and Historical Society has several hundred from Oxfordshire alone. Haines himself catalogued many thousands, but these are from churches that are not Oxfordshire, that are not in the main survey areas, that have received less systematic attention, and 9 of them are unknown to the existing literature. 9 unknown brasses in 8 miles of Cotswolds countryside. He paused. He looked at this. He continued, which suggests that a systematic survey of the remaining churches in this radius would find further examples, and a survey of the adjacent areas, the northern Cotswolds, the area around Winchcombe and Stowe, would find more still. There is no shortage of churches. There is no shortage of brasses. There is only a shortage of the person with the paper and the heel ball willing to make the journey. He put down the pen. He thought, I am, apparently, that person. He was not entirely certain when this had become the case, but it was the case now, and he saw no reason to dispute it. He had known about the William Greville brass for some time in the sense that Haines knew about it, and he had read Haines, which was to say, he had known about it abstractly, as one knows about things one has not seen, which is always a different, an inferior kind of knowing compared to the knowing that comes from having seen the thing. Haines described the Greville brass as one of the finest examples of the late 14th century merchant brass tradition in England, and quoted the inscription in full. Hic jacet Wilhelmus, Gravel decam, de quondam, civis, Londoniensis, flos mercatorum lanatorum, Tocius Angliae, et Margareta uxor aius, which Edward translated silently as, Here lies William Greville of Campden, one citizen of London and flower of the wool merchants of all England, and Margaret, his wife. He had been saving this brass. He was aware of saving it in the way that one is aware of saving a particular bottle of wine or a particular book, not from any explicit decision, but from the tacit recognition that this thing should not be consumed prematurely, that it deserved a moment when one was fully ready for it. By early December, he felt that he was ready. He had 23 rubbings. He had a technique he trusted. He had a system for the catalogue. He was ready for William Greville. Chipping Campden was 11 miles from Northleach, which was too far to walk in winter without planning, He hired a cart from the livery stable at the edge of the market square, the cart operated by a man named Ferris, who had the disposition of someone who had been hiring out carts for 30 years and considered this sufficient acquaintance with the world, and went on a Wednesday morning in the first week of December, when the weather had the particular quality of early December in the Cotswolds, cold but not severe, the sky a white-grey that gave no promise of improvement, but also no threat of deterioration, the kind of day on which nothing dramatic would happen, but in which one could work steadily without expecting difficulty. The road to Chipping Campden went through country that Edward had not yet travelled, slightly north of his usual radius, and the country confirmed what the Southern Territory had established, that this was a landscape shaped by sheep and wool, and the prosperity they had generated, that every village had its church, whose quality was wildly disproportionate to its size, and that the dry stone walls that ran across every hillside were the walls of fields that had been marked out in the same places since the enclosures, and before, since the sheep needed the same ground in the 13th century that they needed in the 19th. Chipping Campden appeared over a low hill, the High Street's line of medieval and Jacobean buildings, the market hall in its arches, and at the far end of the High Street, rising above everything else with the composed authority of a building that knows what it represents, the Tower of St. James. He had given himself the entire day. This was decision made in advance, based on Haines's description of the brass as large and complex, and it was a decision that he found, on arriving in the church, had been correctly made, not because the brass required the entire day in the sense of demanding 9 hours of continuous work, but because the brass and the church around it warranted a slower relationship than his usual procedure allowed. St. James was a church of a different order from the Northleach or Bourton churches. Not better exactly, because the quality of the Cotswold wool churches was generally excellent, and Northleach was itself extraordinary, but different in character. Where Northleach was light and vertical, all height and clerestory, Chipping Campden was lateral and grounded, its nave wide and low-ceilinged by Cotswold standards, its atmosphere more intimate and more domestic, the light entering through clear glass to illuminate a floor that was, Edward could see immediately on entering, exceptionally well preserved, the original medieval stone largely intact, the Victorian restoration confined to the chancel, and the brasses therefore in their original positions in the original floor as they had been for 5 centuries. There were several brasses, of which the Greville was the largest and the most famous. Edward found it immediately. It was impossible not to find it, being positioned centrally in the nave, where any visitor walking toward the altar would pass directly over it, and he stood beside it for several minutes before unpacking anything. William Greville and Margaret, his wife, together on the same plate, in the medieval manner, side by side, he in the long gown, and she in the fitted dress and headdress of the same late 14th century period. The figures were large, well proportioned, executed with a quality of line that spoke of an experienced craftsman working at the upper end of what his workshop could produce. The inscription ran around all 4 sides of the plate in Gothic lettering. Edward read it slowly, following the letters with his eye. The flower of the wool merchants of all England, This man, in this church, in this town that his money and the money of men like him had built, he unpacked the paper, he spread it, he waited his 20 minutes. The rubbing of the gravel brass took 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was longer than any previous rubbing had taken, and which Edward did not notice until he had finished and looked at his watch and discovered that it was 3:15 and the light was already failing. He had been working since shortly after 11. He had not stopped except to stand briefly and walk the circuit of the nave twice to relieve the back and to drink from the flask of tea he had brought for exactly this purpose. He had thought, while working, about William Greville. This was not unusual. He generally thought about the person being copied while he was copying them, the thinking being a natural consequence of the close attention required by the work, which directed his mind toward the figure emerging on the paper, and then, by the easy movement of a mind engaged with history, toward the person the figure represented. But Greville demanded more thought than most. The inscription called him Citizen of London. He had not been from Chipping Campden originally then. He had come here from London, which was itself a significant detail. A man successful enough in the London wool trade to retire to the Cotswolds town that was the source of the wool he had been trading, to build a house on the high street and endow the church with the proceeds of his profits, to be buried here rather than in London, to be described on his memorial not as a Londoner, but as a man of Campden who had once been a citizen of London. The sequence of those words mattered. He had chosen this, flower of the wool merchants of all England. This was not modesty. This was either truth or aspiration, and given the quality of the brass, the expense of commissioning a plate this large and this well executed was considerable. It was probably truth. He had been successful enough to call himself this without being wrong. Edward completed the lower section of the brass, filling in the inscription along the bottom edge, and then the side inscriptions, the heel ball moving carefully around the Gothic letter forms, the letters emerging from the heel ball's darkness, letter by letter, legible now in the paper's image where they had been readable but unremarkable in the brass itself for 480 years. He rolled the rubbing. He gathered the masking tape and the brush. He looked at the floor of the church, where William Greville lay in the stone as he had lain since 1401, unchanged, patient, still the flower of the wool merchants of all England. "Thank you," Edward said, quietly, to the floor. He was not sure who he thought he was thanking. He was sure that the thanks were appropriate. He unrolled the Greville rubbing at the cottage the following morning, because by the time he had returned from Chipping Campden the previous evening, the light was too poor for a proper examination, and he had rolled it carefully and placed it in the wooden box with the others and gone to bed with the particular tiredness of a body that has spent 4 hours on a church floor and that requires no help from the mind to achieve sleep. The morning examination confirmed what the work had suggested. The Greville was the best thing in the collection. Not only the largest, though it was substantially larger than anything else, requiring most of the kitchen table extended and some creative management of the section that extended beyond the table's edge, but the most accomplished, the figures clear and detailed, the inscription legible in its entirety, The heraldic devices on the shields precisely reproduced the general quality of the image, the quality of work that one could hand to a stranger and say, "Here is a wool merchant of 1401." And the stranger would not only understand, but would learn something specific about what he wore, what symbols he chose, what company he kept in death, what words he wished to be associated with. He pinned it to the wall of the bedroom because there was no longer sufficient wall in the sitting room. He stood at the bedroom door and looked at William Greville on his wall, the flower of the wool merchants of all England, black on white, large as life, looking back at him with the generalized dignity of the medieval effigy and the specific gravity of a man who had actually been this important in his actual world. He had been a history teacher for 35 years. He had known, in the abstract, that the people who appeared in the textbooks and the county histories were real. He had told this to boys year after year and had believed it year after year in the way that one believes things one knows to be true. He had not, until now, fully felt it. The physical reality of a specific person in a specific place in a specific time, reproduced on the paper by the same physical process that had reproduced his outline in the brass, the line of contact direct and unbroken across the centuries. He thought, this is why people do this. This is what the paper and the hill ball are for. Clara came for Christmas with the two boys and the solicitor, who was a pleasant man named Martin Fairweather, with a quiet manner and the professional habit of listening carefully before speaking that Edward had always approved of in a son-in-law, and the visit occupied the cottage completely in the way that 4 additional people occupy a small space, comprehensively and with the amiable disorder of people who are comfortable with each other and do not require the formal arrangements of guests. The boys, Oliver, 8, and James, 5, discovered the collection on their first morning. They had been given the bedroom and therefore had woken to William Greville on the wall, which Oliver assessed as a very large knight, the distinction between knight and merchant being not yet fully established at 8, and James as a man with a sheep, the distinction being correctly identified at 5, who was apparently paying closer attention to the relevant detail. They came to Edward at breakfast with questions. "Did you draw him?" James asked, pointing at the rubbing that had been brought downstairs for the morning examination. "I copied him," Edward said, "from a plate in a church floor. He's been in the floor since 1401, which is 482 years. "Did you meet him?" Oliver asked. "He died 482 years ago," Edward said. "So, no. But you know him now," Oliver said, with the persistence of 8 years. "Because you copied him." Edward looked at Oliver. He thought about this question, which was in some sense the question he had been asking himself since September, answered variously and not yet satisfactorily. "In a way," he said, "I know some things about him, his name, his work, what he wore, what he thought was important enough to put on his memorial. I know as much as he was able to tell me, given that he's been in a church floor for 482 years. "That's not much," James said. "No," Edward agreed, "but it's something. Something is not nothing." Clara, who had been listening from the doorway with the attentiveness she brought to conversations in which her father said things he did not usually say, smiled and went to put the kettle on. The letter arrived in the last week of December, addressed in a hand Edward did not recognize, bearing the postmark of Oxford and the return address of the Architectural and Historical Society. He opened it at the kitchen table with his morning coffee and read it with the attention it merited, and then read it again more slowly. It was from a man named Asquith, who described himself as secretary of the society and who wrote in the careful, slightly elevated prose of a man accustomed to corresponding with people he considered both intellectually serious and socially inferior, which was a tone that Edward recognized from his years in academic correspondence, and which he neither liked nor resented, it being simply the tone. The letter said that the society had learned of Edward's work in the Gloucestershire Cotswolds from the vicar of a Northleach church, Payne, obviously, who had apparently recovered from his initial scepticism sufficiently to correspond with Oxford about his tenant's activities, and that the society was interested in knowing more about the nature and extent of the collection being assembled. The letter inquired specifically how many brasses had been copied, from how many churches, over what period, what proportion were known to existing surveys, and what proportion were previously uncatalogued. What was the condition of the paper and the quality of the images, and whether Edward would be willing to contribute copies to the Society's collection, which was kept in Oxford and which was available to scholars working on the history and archaeology of the English medieval period. Edward put the letter down. He looked at the wooden box in the corner, labelled The Cotswolds Collection, with the undated dash. He thought about Oxford. He thought about what Asquith's letter represented, which was the institutional world noticing that something it had not previously known about existed, which was a world Edward was familiar with from his years of teaching, in which the institutional world's attention was both useful and slightly beside the point. He wrote back that evening a precise letter listing the current state of the collection: 26 brasses, 16 churches, 9 entirely uncatalogued, and explaining his method and his materials, and concluding, I would be happy to discuss the possible contribution of copies to the Society's collection. I am not, however, prepared to regard the work as complete. There are further churches in this area that I have not yet visited. The snow came in January, as Cotswold snow generally came, overnight, substantially, covering the dry stone walls to their tops and filling the lanes to a depth that made the difference between a passable road and an impassable one a matter of a few inches, which were the most consequential inches in the landscape's winter arithmetic. Northleach was not entirely cut off. The Cheltenham Road was managed by a snowplough of the kind maintained by the county, and the baker and the butcher continued their operations with the stolid pragmatism of tradespeople whose customers' lives depended on their not being sentimental about weather. But the excursions to outlying churches were not possible for 2 weeks, and Edward was confined, as he had been confined during the November rains, to the materials already at hand. He used the time to work on his catalogue, which had been growing in parallel with the collection, but at a slower pace. The catalogue requiring a different kind of attention from the work of making the rubbings, less physical, more analytical, requiring him to sit with each rubbing at his table and describe what he saw with the precision that a future reader would need if the description were to serve as a substitute for the rubbing itself. He described the figures, the heraldry, the inscriptions, the condition, the estimated date of the brass, and, separately, the estimated date of the engraving. These two dates not always being the same, a late brass sometimes representing an older style, and an early brass sometimes anticipating later conventions. Tom came on Tuesday afternoons, when his mother evidently did not object to his absence, and assisted with the measuring of the rubbings, a two-person job that required Tom to hold one end of the measuring tape, while Edward held the other. And with the transcription of inscriptions into the catalogue, Tom's clear handwriting being, as he had correctly maintained, well suited to the copying of Latin text into English margins. They worked through the afternoons until the light failed, which in January was approximately 4 o'clock. Tom went home for his supper. Edward lit the lamp and continued with the analytical sections of the catalogue, the sections where the description moved from physical fact to interpretation, from what the rubbing showed to what the showing implied. He thought, there is pleasure in this kind of winter work, in the reduction of range that a snowy January produces, the way it clears the desk of the possible and leaves only what is actually present. He had a box of rubbings and a catalogue to write, and a lamp to write it by, and a fire to sit beside. This was enough. On the last Saturday of January, which was the first clear day after the 2-week confinement, Edward went out to walk in the snow before the light failed in the afternoon, which was at 4 o'clock, and which January insisted upon regardless of what one had to do with the light. He went north from the market square, out of the town by the lane that led past the church and up toward the open wold, where the snow lay untouched except by a fox's track that crossed it diagonally from one wall to another, and then disappeared behind the wall as if the fox had considered the open ground and found it wanting. He walked for perhaps half an hour to the high point where the lane crested the wold, and the Cotswolds opened in 3 directions: south toward Cirencester and the Thames Valley, east toward Oxfordshire, west toward the escarpment and the plain of the Severn. In the snow everything was simplified and clarified. The dry stone walls were continuous black lines across the white. The church towers were dark verticals against the pale sky. The horizon was where the white of the fields met the white of the sky and became indistinguishable. He stood at the high point with his hands in his pockets and looked south. Somewhere in that direction, in the churches of the southern Cotswolds and the Thames Valley and the chalk country beyond, there were other brasses. Not his problem. His problem was the 8-mile radius he had established, which he had not yet exhausted. There were 11 churches within that radius that he had not yet visited, 5 of them having brasses listed in Haines, and 6 of them having no listing at all, which meant either no brasses or brasses unknown to the literature. He thought about the unknown woman with the book. He thought about Richard de Frome in his armour. He thought about the small plate of William the beloved child, the child with no name, but the name beloved, which was perhaps the truest name anyone could give a child. He thought, I will start again on Monday when the roads are clear. He turned and walked back toward the town, which was visible from the wold as a cluster of stone roofs and the church tower, small and specific against the larger white of the landscape, exactly where it had been for 600 years. In the first week of February, on a Tuesday afternoon of reasonable light that they had used to visit a church near Sherborne with two small brasses in fair condition, Tom asked the question that Edward had been expecting since roughly October, when Tom had first begun to understand the full scope of what Edward was doing. They were walking back along the field path in the late afternoon light, Edward carrying the bag with the two new rubbings, Tom walking beside him with his hands in his pockets in the posture he used when he was thinking about something and preparing to say it. "Will they know you did it?" Tom said. Edward considered the question. "The catalogue will have my name," he said. "The Oxford Society will record my name as the contributor. In that sense, yes." "But the rubbings themselves," Tom said. "If someone in Oxford looks at them, will they know it was you?" Edward thought about this more carefully. "No," he said. "A rubbing doesn't show who made it. It shows what was on the brass. The person who made it is invisible, in a sense, present in the quality of the work, but not visible in the product." Tom walked for a few steps. "That seems wrong," he said. "Does it?" Edward said. He had been thinking about this himself, in a different way, for some time. Consider the brass itself. Do you know who engraved the forte brass? Tom thought about this. No. The engraver is also invisible in the product. You see John Forte. You don't see the craftsman who made John Forte visible on the brass. And now you see my rubbing, and you don't see me. But John Forte is visible in both, which is presumably the point. Tom walked in silence for a moment. Then, "But you're still there, in the rubbing, even if you can't be seen." "I am still there," Edward agreed. He thought, this is what it means. Not to be seen, but to be in the thing, in the chain that makes the thing possible. At the end of February, Edward opened his notebook to the running catalogue and counted again. 35 brasses from 22 churches in a radius that had extended itself from the original 8 miles to something closer to 12 as he had followed particular threads. A mention in an old county history of a brass at a church he had not visited. A reference in a letter Tom had found in the verger's possession to a great brass that seemed to describe something he had not yet encountered. Of the 35, 14 were entirely uncatalogued. The others were known to the existing literature in varying degrees of detail. He had also, over the past month, begun to receive, through Asquith at the Oxford Society and through Payne's continued correspondence, inquiries from 2 other people working in adjacent areas who had heard about the Northleach collection and who were in the early stages of their own brass rubbing work. He had written to both with the same information, his method, his materials, his catalogue format. He had not suggested they come to Northleach to examine his collection. He had instead suggested they apply the same method in their own areas and share results when they had them. He noted 35 brasses and now at least 2 other people beginning work in adjacent territory. This is not a large movement, but it is more than one person. Tom had made, on his own account, 7 rubbings, of which 4 were of good quality and 3 were of the quality of early attempts, present but blurred. Edward had said, "The 3 blurred ones are the most useful. You know now what not to do. You will not do it again." Tom had accepted this assessment with the seriousness of someone who has been given a technical opinion rather than a compliment, which was the correct way to receive it. The wooden box in the corner was full. Edward had bought a second box. Asquith's letter, in reply to Edward's description of the collection, arrived in the first week of March. It was longer than the first letter and written in a tone that had modulated somewhat from the original, which had been the tone of an institution addressing a provincial amateur towards something that still maintained the institutional distance, but had incorporated, somewhere in its middle sections, a quality that Edward read as genuine interest. The specific number of uncatalogued brasses, 14 out of 35, had evidently produced an effect, because Asquith devoted 2 paragraphs to the question of how Edward had identified the uncatalogued ones and what criteria he was using for the assessment, which were precisely the right questions and the questions of someone who was thinking seriously about the work rather than simply noting its existence. He wrote back with a full account of the methodology, the comparison with Haines's county surveys, the secondary check against the Society's own published list of known Gloucestershire brasses, the additional comparison with the Victoria County history entries for each parish, and the residual category of brasses that appeared in none of these sources. He sent, with the letter, 3 photographs that he had commissioned from a photographer in Cheltenham, who had visited Northleach at Edward's request and photographed the John Forte, Richard de Frome, and William Greville rubbings against a white wall, the photographs being the reproducible form of the rubbings that could be sent to Oxford without sending the originals. He noted in his notebook, "I have not decided whether to send the originals to Oxford. The decision is not urgent. The work is not finished." The letter concluded with a paragraph that Edward read several times. Asquith wrote, "If the collection you describe is of the extent and quality you indicate, it would represent a significant contribution to the Gloucestershire survey, which, as you may be aware, is the most incomplete of the Society's county collections. The Society would be pleased to receive the rubbings as a formal contribution, to be catalogued under your name, for inclusion in the archive at the Ashmolean. We would also be interested in knowing whether you intend to extend the survey, and if so, to what boundaries, under your name." Edward held the letter for a moment, thinking about this. The rubbings would be catalogued under his name, in the Ashmolean, where they would be available to scholars working on medieval Gloucestershire for as long as the Ashmolean maintained its collections, which was to say, very likely, for longer than Edward could easily imagine. He wrote back, "Yes, I intend to extend the survey." The church at a small hamlet 4 miles southeast of Northleach was locked, and the vicar lived in Bourton and visited on alternate Sundays, and the verger had the key but was visiting a brother in Gloucester for a fortnight, and the churchwarden had the spare key but was bedridden with a cough. This information came from a woman at the hamlet's single cottage, who told it to Edward with the pleasurable precision of someone who knows exactly where everything is and finds satisfaction in the comprehensive enumeration of obstacles. Edward thanked her and noted in his book, "Saint name unclear from map, near Chedworth. Access, currently impossible. Retry in April. Church guide, held by woman at cottage, mentions several ancient brasses of interest." He walked back to the road where Tom was waiting with the lent bicycle and the borrowed bicycle, which they had found more efficient than walking for distances above 2 miles. "Locked," Edward said. "I thought it might be," Tom said, with the equanimity of a 12-year-old who has learned that obstacles are part of the work rather than interruptions to it. "There's another church at the top of the lane, about a mile. The woman who does the flowers there said there's something in the floor that no one's touched in years." "The woman who does the flowers," Edward said, "is a source I had not considered." "My mother knows her," Tom said. "I can ask." Edward looked at Tom, who was straddling his bicycle with the absolute confidence of a boy who knows the landscape in a radius of 10 miles and has a network of practical contacts of which the flower arranger was only the most recently deployed. He thought, "I would have given up at the locked door. I would have consulted the map and gone home." He thought, "I have an extremely useful collaborator." "Yes," he said, "ask your mother's friend." He had been watching for long enough and helping for long enough that the mechanics of the work were entirely clear to him, and the request, when it came, was a request Edward had been expecting. "Can I do one?" They were in a church near Winchcombe in the 3rd week of February, and the brass in question was a small plate, a knight's shield without a figure, mid-15th century, perhaps 14 inches square, small enough to be manageable for a first attempt, but complex enough to be instructive in its complexity, having heraldic quartering that required precision in the heel ball strokes to render clearly. Edward explained the procedure as if explaining it for the first time, which he did for Tom's benefit, but also because explaining it again clarified for himself what he had learned to do instinctively: the tensioning of the paper, the weighting, the hand position, the direction of the strokes. Tom listened with the quality of attention that he brought to things he actually wanted to know, which was a quality Edward recognized from the best students of his 35 years, and which always produced the same small interior satisfaction. Tom made the rubbing. It was not the best rubbing Edward had seen. The heel ball pressure was uneven, lighter in the center than at the edges, which suggested that Tom was more confident at the edges, where he had a firm boundary to reference. The heraldic quartering was somewhat blurred in the central joint, but the general shape was clear, the shield recognizable as a shield, the quartering as quartering. "The pressure in the center," Edward said, "more even." "I know," Tom said. "I could feel it." He looked at the rubbing without satisfaction, and then with satisfaction of the modest kind, not pride, but assessment. "Better next time," he said. "Yes," Edward said. He rolled the rubbing and labelled it in Tom's handwriting, because the rubbing was Tom's. Tom Arkle, St. Peter's, near Winchcombe. February 1884. First attempt. Asquith came from Oxford in the 2nd week of March, arriving by the morning train to Cheltenham, and then by the carrier's coach to Northleach, appearing at Edward's cottage door in the early afternoon with the urban air of a man who has not spent much time in the Cotswolds and is privately adjusting his estimate of its remoteness. He was a man in his early 50s, precise in his dress, with the particular manner of an academic who has spent his career in institutions and has learned to assess people quickly and silently, and to deal with the assessments later. Edward took him into the cottage and showed him the collection. Asquith was more silent than his letters had suggested he would be, which Edward interpreted as genuine attention rather than indifference, genuine attention being frequently indistinguishable from indifference in its outward signs. He examined the rubbings one by one, spending the most time with the diaphragm and the gravel, holding each to the light, and then laying it flat and moving along it with the same finger-on-brass motion that Edward had used when learning the surfaces. "You said 9 uncatalogued when you first wrote," Asquith said. "Now 14. The survey continues. Asquith looked at the 2 wooden boxes. 35, you said, from 22 churches. 23 now. I went to a church near Bourton on Monday." A pause. Asquith appeared to be deciding whether to say something directly or to say something adjacent to it. He chose direct. The Society would consider this, in total, a significant contribution. The Gloucestershire survey is incomplete. What you have done here, in a radius of 12 miles, in, 6 months? 7 months. It represents a model for systematic coverage that the Society has not achieved by more organized means. The individual working in his own territory, who knows the churches and the vicars and the locked doors. Edward said, "And the boy who knows the flower arranger." Asquith looked at him. Something shifted slightly in the precise expression. "Quite," he said, which was not much, but was, from Asquith, something. He had been trying since October to find a name for the woman with the book from the Chedworth Church. He had approached it in the way he approached all the problems the collection presented, methodically, using the available tools, Haines, the county histories, the Oxford Society's records, and the additional resource of the vestry registers and churchwardens' accounts that Payne had helped him access in the churches that had them. The Chedworth Church had a partial vestry register beginning in the 15th century, which he had examined in January and which contained, in its earliest section, a list of church benefactors, people who had made donations to the church's fabric in the period between 1420 and 1480, listed by name and amount. The list was in a handwriting of the period, somewhat difficult to read, and Edward had spent an afternoon with it in the vestry with the magnifying glass he had bought for the catalogue work. On the 3rd page of the list, in an entry dated 1483, he found Agnes de Wyke, widow of Thomas de Wyke, merchant of Chedworth, for the repair of the south window and a mass to be said for her husband. 10 shillings. He sat with this for a long moment. The entry was not proof. There were surely other women in the parish who had died in the relevant period. But it was a name, a connection to the church, a widow of a merchant, a woman of sufficient substance to have made a donation to the church fabric. The date of the donation, 1483, was consistent with the estimated period of the brass. A widow making a donation for her husband's soul and having a brass made for herself. The 2 things were consistent. He wrote in his catalogue, "Unknown woman, holding book, circa 1390. Probably Agnes de Wyke, widow of Thomas de Wyke of Chedworth, flourished 1483. Note, not certain. Probably is the limit of what can be said." He thought, she is still probably unknown. But probably is not nothing. Probably is much better than unknown. He went back to St. Peter and St. Paul on a morning in early March, when the light was the light that had been absent since October. Clear, direct, not the raking low-angled light of winter, but the light of a sun that had climbed back above the line of the hills and was arriving at an angle that made the honey goldstone glow rather than merely reflect. The market square was golden in this light, which was not a figure of speech, but a plain description of the colour of the limestone under direct early spring sunlight. Warm gold, the colour of stored heat returning. He had not planned to make a rubbing that morning. He had planned to walk the market square and then spend the afternoon with the catalogue. But the light was too good for a catalogue afternoon. He went into the church instead, to the nave, to the familiar section of floor where John Forte had been waiting for him since September. He stood beside the Forte brass in the spring light. The brass itself was unchanged. It was, after all, metal, and metal did not change in the way that the light changed or the season changed. But the light falling on it gave the engraving a quality it had not had in the autumn or winter. The raised lines caught the spring light at a slight angle and threw tiny shadows, making the figure legible in a way that was almost three-dimensional, almost sculptural, as if John Forte were briefly on the surface of the floor rather than in it. "You look better in spring," Edward said to the floor, in the same quiet voice he had used to thank William Greville in Chipping Campden. He was not sure when he had begun talking to the brasses. He was reasonably sure it was not a cause for concern. He was on his way out of the church, having decided on the walk after all, when he noticed, in the light he had not previously had access to in this form, a small detail on the Forte brass that he had not noticed before. In the lower right corner of the plate, not part of the main engraving, but scratched rather than cut, 3 letters in a small cramped hand, WHB, an initial or a craftsman's mark, or a note that had been added later by someone who had wanted to be remembered in the only way available to a person who could not afford a brass of their own. He went back for his materials. He filled the first catalogue notebook at the end of March, the last entry on the last page, completed with the same black ink and the same careful upright hand that had begun the first entry in September, was for a small brass at a church east of Northleach that contained only an inscription, no figure, commemorating a man named Henry Aller, who had died in 1471 and whose only known fact from the inscription was that he had been the beadle of the Wool Merchants' Fellowship of that town for 20 years. Henry Aller, beadle of the Wool Merchants' Fellowship. 20 years of service. One inscription. Not even a figure. Edward wrote the entry carefully, including the note. Beadle, the officer responsible for the maintenance of order at the fellowship's meetings and for the administration of its records. A man of the administrative middle, not a merchant, not a labourer, but the person who kept the fellowship's workings functional. His memorial is proportional to his station. An inscription, not a figure, but a brass rather than a painted stone. He closed the first notebook. He opened the second. He wrote, on the first page of the second notebook, the date and the entry number, continuing the sequence from the first. Entry 41. He had been writing in the first notebook since September. It was now March. He had filled a notebook. He thought about this. He thought about all the things that could be represented by a notebook filled over 6 months. The kilometres walked, the churches entered, the vicars negotiated with, the floors knelt upon, the hours of heel-ball work. All of those things were contained in their summary form in the 40 entries of this first notebook. The entries were the remaining substance of all that work, the residue that would persist after all the walking and the kneeling and the cold November light were gone. He put the first notebook on the shelf between Haines's manual and the county history. He picked up the heel ball. He went back to work. He walked out to the high point of the wold on a Saturday morning in April, when the morning was clear and the air had the particular warmth that April mornings in the Cotswolds produce when the wind was from the south and the sky had not yet clouded, and the Cotswolds were doing what the Cotswolds do in April when they choose to be beautiful, which was to be maximally themselves. The dry stone walls bright in the light, the new grass an aggressive green against the warm stone, the hawthorn in the hedgerows beginning its annual statement of intent, the church towers at their varying distances catching the morning sun and returning it in the way of things that have been catching and returning the sun for 600 years and are entirely accustomed to the practice. He stood at the high point with his bag over his shoulder and looked at the landscape he had been walking through since September. He had been in Northleach for 7 months. He had walked, by his rough calculation, between 200 and 400 miles since arriving, depending on whether one counted the shorter excursions and the many walks taken without rubbing purpose, in the getting to know the territory sense that had preceded and accompanied the collection. He had 41 brasses. 3 more churches remained in his immediate radius that he had not fully explored. Beyond that radius, the churches of the northern Cotswolds extended towards Stowe and Moreton in Marsh and Broadway. The country he had not yet entered, the churches he had not yet visited, the brasses he had not yet found. He thought, I am not finished. I did not come to Northleach to be finished. I came to see the things I had spent 35 years describing from a distance, and I am seeing them, and there are more of them to see than I anticipated. And I do not intend to stop because I have filled 1 notebook and bought a 2nd box for the rubbings. Below him, in the town, the church clock struck 9. He turned down the hill. April in the Cotswolds was a different country from the Cotswolds of September, which had been golden and settled, or October, which had been golden and cooling, or the winter months, which had been beautiful in the specific beauty of a landscape stripped to its essentials. April was the country of spring in full assertion, spring making its argument in every direction simultaneously. The beeches coming into leaf, the hawthorn coming into blossom, the sheep with their lambs in the fields below the dry stone walls, the church swifts beginning to return to their nesting places in the towers, the mornings bright and the evenings long, and the light extending its hours as if determined to compensate for the months of its constraint. Edward walked further in April than in any previous month, which was partly because the days were longer and the weather reliable, and partly because the winter's confinements had produced in him a desire for range that the spring's possibilities encouraged. He went to churches he had put off visiting because of the distance, a church near the Oxfordshire border, a church in the fold of a valley accessible only by a track that had been impassable in January's mud and February's frost, and found in both cases what the winter's patience had kept in reserve, brasses of the kind that rewarded the journey, that were worth the distance. He also, in April, began something he had not done in the previous months. He went back to churches he had already visited, not to make new rubbings of what he had already copied, but to look at what he had copied in the new light, to see whether the spring changed what September had shown him. In some cases, it did not change anything significant. The brass looked as it had looked. The rubbing had been an accurate reproduction. The work was done. In other cases, the spring light revealed details he had missed, a faint inscription he had not registered in the October light, a small emblem he had copied without noticing its significance, the WHB on the forte brass that he had copied again in the spring light and labelled now. Probably craftsman's mark, possibly initials of a previous owner or commissioner. The spring light and the autumn light were not the same light. He found the child brass in a church near Bourton at the end of April, in a corner of the nave that had received less attention from the Victorian restorer than the rest of the floor, a corner that had retained its medieval surface, and in which, beneath a 19th century pew that had been installed directly over a section of floor without apparently checking what was underneath it, there was a small brass plate of the kind that he had now seen twice before, the memorial to a child. The plate was approximately 12 inches wide and 8 inches long, smaller than the John Forte, and considerably smaller than the Richard de Frome. It showed no figure. Children's brasses rarely did, the expense of a full figure engraving being generally reserved for adults of standing, but only a Latin inscription, and at the centre, a simple engraved cross of the kind that represented both the Christian faith and the hope of resurrection that the faith offered as consolation to parents who had buried a child. He read the inscription. He had, over the months, improved considerably at reading medieval Latin inscriptions, his schoolmaster's Latin reasserting itself with the confidence that dormant knowledge recovers when the occasion requires it. The inscription said, "Here lies Alice, daughter of John and Emma Bray, who departed this life in the year of our Lord 1412, aged 7 years. God grant her rest. Aged 7 years. 1412. Alice Bray. She had a name. He made the rubbing with the care he brought to all the small brasses, the care that the small brasses required more than the large ones, because the engraved lines were finer and closer and demanded a lighter hand. Alice Bray emerged on the paper, the cross, the inscription, the date, the hope that had been expressed 600 years ago, and that was still legible, still coherent, still addressed to whatever reader found it. He labelled the rubbing, Alice Bray, aged 7 years, Bourton on the Water area, 1412. He labelled it with her full name and her age, because those were the specific things she had been given, and he was not going to reduce her to a category. He sat for a time in the pew, as he had sat in the pew at Chedworth after the unknown woman. God grant her rest, he said quietly to the floor, completing the inscription. He thought it was the right thing to say. Tom had been making his own rubbings for 3 months by May, and his collection had reached 7, of which the 2 most recent were of quality comparable to Edward's own early work, which was to say they were competent and clear, if not yet fully fluent. He kept them in a box of his own, a wooden box that he had made himself in the late winter months, with a lid that fitted properly and a clasp. a box of precisely the right dimensions for the rolled rubbings and plainly constructed in the way of things made by 12-year-olds who have been shown what the purpose requires and have met the requirement directly. The box was in his bedroom at his parents' house. Tom had told Edward this in the matter-of-fact way he told him most things, and Edward had noted it and thought about what it meant, that Tom was keeping a collection, not helping with someone else's collection, keeping a collection. The distinction was the distinction between Tom as Edward's assistant and Tom as a person who had developed his own relationship to this work and was pursuing it on his own terms in his own place. He told Tom this. He said, "You are making a collection." Tom said, "I know. Have you thought about what it is a collection of?" Tom thought about this with his characteristic visible pause. "The church is near Northleach," he said. "The brasses I can get to on a bicycle." "That is a collection," Edward said, "with a clear boundary and a clear method. That is what a collection is." Tom looked at him with a direct look. "You have one too," he said. "I do," Edward agreed, "with a larger radius, but the same method." He paused. He thought about how to say what he wanted to say. "When I leave Northleach," he said, "the churches will still be there. The brasses will still be there. If you continue, you will know things about them that I won't know from wherever I am. You will find things I didn't find." Tom processed this. He said, "I know where there's one you haven't been to, near Farmington. Very small church. The farmer keeps the key." Then Edward said, "We should go to Farmington." He packed the rubbings in the 3rd week of May, on a morning when the spring was at its height, and the Cotswolds were as beautiful as they were going to be that year, and possibly as beautiful as they had been since the last spring. That was this good, which was a thought he had every spring, and which was probably true every spring, each spring being the best spring one had experienced since it was a spring and not a previous spring. The packing required care. He had bought a wooden crate of the right dimensions from the Cheltenham carpenter who had made his second storage box, and lined it with cotton wool and brown paper, and arranged the rubbings inside it rolled and in their individual brown paper wrappings, each labelled with the catalogue entry number and the brief identification. Forte, Northleach, 1458. De Frome, near Borden, 1412. Greville, Campden, 1401. And so on, down through the 41. He was not sending all 41. He was sending 35. The 31 that he considered fully finished, well made, fully catalogued, ready to be used by a scholar without further explanation. And 4 that he was sending with notes indicating that the catalogue entry was incomplete and would be supplemented by further research. He was keeping 6, the Forte, which was the first, the William, the beloved child, because something about keeping the child felt correct, Alice Bray, because she had a name, and 3 others that he could not fully account for keeping except to say that they were his in some way he did not wish to entirely surrender. He sealed the crate. He wrote Asquith's Oxford address on the outside, with the Society's name in full. He left it in the hall for the morning carrier. He went to the sitting room. The rubbings that had been on the wall, most of them, were now in the crate. The wall was largely empty. He looked at the empty wall for a moment. He thought, now I can see the wall. He thought, good, there is more work to do. I will need the wall space. The acknowledgement from Asquith came by return of post, 3 days after the crate had been sent, which was faster than Edward had expected, and which suggested that its arrival had been noted and the note immediately written. It said, in full, Mr. Holt, the collection arrived safely this morning. I have examined it briefly. I will examine it thoroughly. The Society will catalogue these under your name with the dates and, where applicable, notes on their significance. On behalf of the Society and the Ashmolean, my thanks. I note you have kept 6. I assume these are the 6 you intend to continue working on, or the 6 that are personally meaningful to you. Either reason is a good reason. H. Asquith. Edward read this twice, then a third time for the last sentence. Either reason is a good reason. He had not expected this particular accommodation of the personal by the institutional, and he appreciated it precisely because it was unexpected. He wrote back, Dear Mr. Asquith, thank you. The 6 I have kept are both. There are churches in this area that I have not yet finished. I intend to continue. E. Holt. He folded the note and sealed it and put it on the hall table for the post. He looked at the hall table, which had an empty surface above the single drawer where letters awaited posting, and a wall behind it where, 6 months ago, the forte rubbing had hung before being moved to make way for the Frome. The wall was plain now. He went upstairs and looked at the bedroom wall where the William Greville still hung, and the William beloved child, and Alice Bray with her 7 years, and her God grant her rest. These were his. They would stay. Tom's information about the church near Farmington proved accurate in every detail. There was indeed a very small church, the size of a large room, set in a fold of the hill east of Farmington, on land that belonged to a farm, whose farmer kept the key on a hook in his kitchen, and who had no objection whatsoever to a retired schoolmaster coming to look at the floor, having no particularly strong feelings about the floor himself one way or another. The church had not been restored. This was apparent immediately on entering. The Victorian passion for restoration had not reached this small, unprofitable, inconveniently located foundation, and therefore the church was as it had been for several centuries, which meant it was somewhat dilapidated, but entirely authentic. The medieval plaster still on the walls in portions, the medieval floor tiles in the nave, the chancel arch of the 12th century looking exactly like a 12th century chancel arch that had not been touched since the 12th century, which was rare, and in the floor of the nave, near the west wall, a brass that had clearly not been disturbed in any way since it had been set there, which Haines's manual had not mentioned, which no survey had recorded, which had been lying there under the dust of centuries with the patience of things that do not require attention to be real. It was small, and it was old, and it was in poorer condition than most of what Edward had worked with, the surface worn smooth in places by the feet of generations of parishioners who had walked over it without knowing or caring what was beneath the worn surface. But the central portion of the figure was clear. A priest in vestments, with his hands folded at his chest, his face the standard medieval face, his feet resting on a cushion, and the date in the inscription was legible. M.C.C.C.X.L.I.X. 1349, the year of the Black Death. Edward sat beside the brass for a moment before unpacking anything. 1349. a priest who had died in the year that the plague had killed 1/3 of England. He did not know if this priest had died of the plague. The inscription did not say. The inscription gave only the name William de Farmington and the date and the standard prayer for his soul. But 1349 in a Cotswolds village was an inescapable context. He unpacked his materials. He began. He waited the 20 minutes before beginning, as he always waited. But on this particular afternoon, the 20 minutes had a different quality from the usual waiting. The usual waiting was the waiting of a practical procedure. One waited because the paper needed time to settle, because the heel ball required an even surface, because Haines had specified it, and Haines was correct. The waiting in the small, unrestored church near Farmington was that, and also something else, something that he could only describe as the waiting of a man who is about to do something for the last time, and who is not yet ready for the last time to begin. He was not certain this would be the last brass. He had not decided to stop, but he knew, sitting on the stone floor of this small medieval church with the 20-minute wait extending around him, that this brass was different from the others, not in kind, but in quality, different in the way that the last item in a series is sometimes different from all the preceding items, not because it is inherently different, but because it arrives at the end and therefore carries the weight of all the ones that came before it. He thought about John Forte, September. He thought about Richard de Frome, November. He thought about William Greville, December. He thought about the unknown woman with her book. He thought about Alice Bray, aged 7. He thought about Tom's box in its bedroom, and the dash at the end of 1883 on the wooden crate lid, the dash that left room for what was not yet finished. He thought, they were all here before me. They will be here after. I am in the middle of this, in the period between when they arrived and when they will finally be gone. And what I have done is to be present in that middle period with my paper and my heel ball and my notebook, to be the person who was here when they were still findable, when they could still be read, when there was still someone willing to kneel on a cold stone floor for them. The 20 minutes passed. He pressed his fingers along the paper, finding the edges of William de Farmington beneath it. He began. He finished the rubbing in the late afternoon, at the point when the light through the small western window had gone from the yellow of afternoon to the gold of early evening, and he sat back on his heels and looked at what he had made. William de Farmington, priest, 1349, in the poor condition of 6 centuries on an unremarked floor, had come onto the paper with the clarity that good technique and good materials and 7 months of practice could produce. The priest's figure central, the vestments folds legible, the hands at his chest clear, the inscription partially legible, partially not. The partially not was not failure. The worn surface of the brass had simply not transferred where the brass was too smooth, the engraving too shallow, the century's feet too thorough. He had reproduced what was there. What was not there was not reproducible, and pretending otherwise would have produced a dishonest copy, and a dishonest copy was not the point. He rolled the rubbing. He labelled it William de Farmington, priest, near Farmington, Gloucestershire, 1349, previously unrecorded. Then he sat for a moment on the stone floor, in the quiet of the unrestored church, before standing. Through the small window, the Cotswolds evening was doing what Cotswolds evenings did in May, extending the light until it became unnecessary to extend it further, and then extending it a little more, the sky moving through its gradations of blue and gold without particular hurry, the dry stone walls becoming slightly less distinct in the softer light, the church tower, some other church, visible in the distance, catching the last of the directional light on its upper courses and holding it the way limestone holds light, receiving and returning in equal measure. He put his hand on the stone floor beside him. The stone was cold. It was the same stone as Northleach, the same stone as Chipping Campden, the same stone as every church he had entered in the past 7 months. The Cotswolds limestone, honey gold in sun, grey in shadow, ancient in both conditions, and still here. He stood up. He picked up his bag. He went out into the May evening. He opened the second notebook the following morning and continued the catalogue from entry 41. The William de Farmington entry, entry 42, took more space than usual because the annotations were fuller. The significance of the date, the unusual condition of the church, the note about what could and could not be read, the assessment of the probability that this was the same William de Farmington mentioned in a 1453 document he had found in the Cheltenham County Records Office on a visit in January, which mentioned a bequest to the Church of Farmington from the descendants of one William de Farmington, late priest of that parish, which was consistent with the brass's date. He also added, at the end of the entry, something he had not added to previous entries, a note that read, "The Farmington Church is in poor condition and may not survive another generation of neglect. The brass is in fair condition, but deteriorating. If this rubbing is not made again before the church is either restored, which would likely damage the brass, or declines further, which would damage the brass through inaction, this copy may become the only readable record of William de Farmington's memorial." He looked at this sentence. He thought, yes, that is the point. Not the scholarship, not the catalogue, not the Oxford Society's archive, not even the acknowledgement of the names. The point is that when the church is full, when the floors are replaced, when the years do what years do to metal that has not been protected, the record survives. The record is the thing. He put down the pen. He picked up the Haines manual. He opened it to the entry for the Gloucestershire churches north of Morton in Marsh, which he had not yet visited. There were several churches listed with brasses in that area. He thought, the Cotswolds extends north of Morton. I have not gone there. He went to St. Peter and St. Paul on the first Tuesday of May, which was the usual day and the usual church, though he had not been there since the March morning when he had found the WHB scratched into the corner of the forte plate. He went in the morning when the market square was beginning its day and the butcher and the baker were exchanging the morning's first conversation across their respective thresholds, and the church tower was catching the early light with the same composed authority it brought to every morning. He let himself in through the south porch. Payne had given him a permanent key 4 months ago, when it had become clear that the irregularity of Edward's visits exceeded the predictability of Payne's availability, and he walked down the nave to the section of floor he knew best in any church in the Cotswolds. The central nave, where John Forte had been lying since 1458. He stood beside the brass. He did not take out his materials. He simply stood for a few minutes, in the way that one stands beside a thing one has known for a time and is still learning. Then he went to the north aisle, where there was a section of floor he had not fully examined, which he had noted in February as requiring further attention, but had not returned to. He crouched down and looked at the stone. In the far corner of the aisle, partially under a fixed bench that had been there since at least the 17th century, and possibly longer, there was a slight change in the stone surface, a slight regularity, a slight difference in the color of the dust that had settled in the joins. He moved the bench with the effort it required from a man of 64, moving a bench of 3 centuries. And the bench moved, and there it was, a brass, small, perhaps a foot square, its upper surface worn smooth by the bench's legs over the centuries, but with a border inscription that was still legible in the right light, the right being the morning light that is now coming through the north window. He took out his bag. He took out the paper. He put on his reading glasses. He read the inscription. He took out the heel ball. He began again. The brass rubber of the Cotswolds, Northleach, Gloucestershire, September 1883 to May 1884. Based on the real history of brass rubbing in Victorian England and the Oxford Architectural and Historical Society's collection, now held at the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. The brasses of William Greville, died 1401, and John Forte, died 1458, are real memorials in their respective Cotswolds churches.